Hello, welcome to Learning Thursdays. I am Patty Corbett Ward from Learning Development Unit, OASAS Albany, and I will be your host today for the August presentation of the Learning Thursdays series. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker, Paul Warren, who I'm actually very happy to introduce you to. He's a phenomenal speaker. He brings a lot of knowledge, passion, and interaction to our Learning Thursdays, and he has done this a number of times for us in the past. However, I would like to just do a brief intro to our Learning Thursdays, both for those who've attended before and those of you who are new. Very simple. They're offered to our professionals as a free learning opportunity, and the goal simply is to help improve the knowledge and skills of our workforce as you strive to improve the lives of the people who come through your doors for treatment, prevention, and recovery. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to the learningthurs@oasas.ny.gov mailbox. All that being said, very simply again, I'm very happy to introduce you to Paul Warren. He will be doing the presentation entitled The Coming Out Process and LGBTQI People. And I'm going to ask Paul to introduce himself and go forward from there. Thank you for joining us, and Paul, thank you and welcome.
So thank you so much, Patty, for that introduction, and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself before we dive into the content. I'm a social worker by training, and currently I'm the Deputy Executive Director at NDRI USA here in Manhattan, and I'm also the Director of the Training Institute there and the Director of Training for the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. So that's just a little bit about me before we jump into this particular content. And I'll also add that there are a couple of things I'd like you to do sort of in preparation for what we're going to look into today. One is if you could take a moment and get something to write with and maybe a piece of paper to write on, because at a certain point during this broadcast, I'm going to ask you to write a few things down that you might want to refer to later. So if you could go ahead and take a moment and get some paper and get a pen or pencil to write with, that would be great. And the other thing, just so we're clear in terms of the content, is you'll notice that the title of this course is The Coming Out Process and LGBTQI People. Let's dispense with what LGBTQI means at the very beginning, which lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning or queer, and intersexed. Throughout the slide deck, we interchange between LGBTQI and simply LGB. The acronym LGB in and of itself can be an umbrella acronym for all the people who might be in gender nonconforming and or non-heterosexual sexual orientations. So we're going to go back and forth between those, but I just wanted to lay that out for you at the beginning. And when we are speaking of just LGBT, we mean the entire community, just so that's clear. So having said that, let's look at some of the learning objectives for this particular opportunity. And actually, before we look at those, I do want to thank Patty and OASAS for the opportunity to be here with you today to talk about the coming out process. So let's look at the objectives. So I think it's important when we're talking about the coming out process to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, I think it's important to describe and understand the relationship between sexual orientation and gender identity, where they actually relate and where they actually don't relate. The other thing is that there are various steps of the coming out process. My hope is that by the end of our time together today, you will be able to identify at least two of those steps, and hopefully all of them. Also, it's important, given that we're substance use disorder service providers, and other service providers may also be watching this broadcast, but it's important to keep in mind that there is a distinct relationship between recovery and the recovery process, and I mean that in a very broad sense, as well as the coming out process. So we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that. And there are also particular counseling interventions or techniques that are probably most beneficial for you to use when you're working with somebody who may be in the process of coming out, or maybe has come out in a particular situation or setting and has had a particular experience that they might need or want support in regard to. So we'll also talk about some of those counseling interventions and some of those techniques specifically. So that really lays out the content that we will try and discuss during this brief 90-minute period. So having said that, why don't we go ahead and jump in. And the question that we're probably all asking, and maybe not asking because some people may know this themselves, some people may have experienced this themselves, is what is coming out? Well, before we discuss that, let's talk a little bit about sexual orientation, sex assigned at birth, and gender, because these three concepts can be related to coming out and they inform the coming out process. So let's all be on the same page about what these things mean specifically. So let's start with sexual orientation. Now, I'd like you to take a moment and think for yourself, how would you personally define sexual orientation? So think about that for a moment. What is your definition of it? I've asked this question in many face-to-face trainings, and people talk about various things, and I'm going to provide us with kind of a baseline description or definition of what sexual orientation is, but I think it can be helpful for you to start with what your conception of sexual orientation is. So take a moment and frame that in your mind for yourself. This is a definition, and you'll see it on the slide in a moment. This is a definition that I'd like to throw out for you to consider. And perhaps you can rent this for the 90 minutes if you don't particularly agree with this. But I throw it out to you as something to consider as a definition. First and foremost, sexual orientation is an enduring pattern. It's something that somebody repeats, they go back to, they continue to do, or continue to think about, of emotional or sexual attraction. And you'll notice that emotional and sexual are together here as part of sexual orientation, to others of a particular sex or to both sexes. So some individuals identify as bisexual, others identify as exclusively heterosexual, some identify as exclusively attracted to the same sex. The other thing to consider about sexual orientation is that it's an intrinsic personal characteristic. Now, many people say, what exactly does an intrinsic personal characteristic mean? Think of it as this, and I'll reveal later that I didn't come up with this particular phrase. I borrowed it from a scholarly article that I read. An intrinsic personal characteristic is something that is so much a part of somebody, it really can't be separated out of them. It's part of their makeup, their wiring, their weave. So it's something to really consider as an intrinsic personal characteristic. Also, sexual orientation is on a continuum. We have a tendency in the United States to talk about really primarily three sexual orientations. The first one, of course, is heterosexuality, being attracted to people of the opposite sex physically and emotionally. We also talk about same-sex attraction, being attracted to people of the same sex. And we also talk about bisexuality, people being attracted to both sexes. Now, sexual orientation is on a continuum. No two heterosexuals experience their sexual orientation the same way. They would fall probably on different places on the continuum of sexual orientation because they experience their heterosexuality differently. The same with LGBT people. And let's be very clear, T, transgender, is not a sexual orientation. And we'll get to that as we go forward a little bit. But LGB are sexual orientations. So no two LGB individuals experience their sexual orientation the same way. So again, if you can imagine me stretching my arms out as wide as possible, think of sexual orientation as a continuum and someone's experience of their sexual orientation as one point on a very long and large continuum and series of possibilities. So again, enduring pattern of emotional and sexual attraction to people of a particular sex or to both sexes, intrinsic personal characteristic, and on a continuum. Having said that, as an umbrella to talk about sexual orientation, let's dig just a little bit deeper into sexual orientation and talk about three specific components of it. And everyone has a sexual orientation and everyone has a gender identity. These are two separate things, and now we're focusing on sexual orientation. More complexly looking at sexual orientation, let's think of it in these three particular perspectives. The first one is attraction. Who do you fantasize about? What do you think about sexually? What do you desire to do? What are you drawn to? That's attraction. Then there's identity. And I would also frame that there can be identities, because some people may have an identity that they own for themselves, and they may have a different identity in a different setting, or different identities in different settings. So identity is how you identify your sexual orientation to yourself and to others and in particular settings. And then there's behavior. There's exactly and specifically what individuals or what an individual does sexually, the sex acts that they actually engage in. So when we're talking about orientation, let's try and think of it in a more complex way, with the understanding that sexual behaviors do not dictate sexual orientation. Lots of people who have different sexual orientations like similar sexual behaviors and very different sexual behaviors. So let's be very clear, because the conception usually is that if an individual engages in anal intercourse, that means that they are gay. Let's be very clear. Gay men have not cornered the market on anal intercourse. There are heterosexual couples that also engage in anal intercourse. And again, it's a sexual behavior on a continuum of sexual orientations. Just so we're clear and we respect the uniqueness and the individuality of everybody's experience of their sexual orientation. So, there is a phrase that is often referred to as synonymous with sexual orientation, which is sexual preference. I want to be clear with people that when we're talking about sexual orientation, we are talking about that enduring pattern of emotional and sexual attraction to people of a particular sex or to both sexes. When you use the phrase sexual preference, it is actually inaccurate to substitute that for sexual orientation. Sexual preference refers to sexual behavior. I prefer to engage in one sex act over another. So it's an incorrect term if you're using it to talk about sexual orientation. It also implies that orientation is a choice, and let's be clear that sexual orientation is not something that people choose. They choose sexual behaviors that they're going to engage in, but they don't choose the orientation. The orientation presents itself to each human being, and they may act on it, they may not act on it. So again, that's where this phrase intrinsic personal characteristic comes from. The other reason to avoid this particular phrase when we're talking about sexual orientation is because it has been used in the past as a tool to oppress and discriminate people who do not identify as heterosexual. So what I'm going to ask is that after this 90 minutes that we have together, when you speak about sexual orientation, that you use that terminology. You'll be accurate and you'll really be supporting clarity around what sexual orientation is. If you're talking about sexual behavior, feel free to say sexual preference. I prefer this sexual behavior over that. So just as a favor to me, when this is over, please be clear about that terminology and be clear about how the terminology actually has been used in the past to oppress people. So it's also important to understand that the American Psychological Association has made it clear, based on the data and the research, that sexual orientation is not a choice. It's an intrinsic personal characteristic, and again, that's where I borrowed that phrase from an article that the APA wrote on sexual orientation. They've identified that it's determined by many different factors, usually at a very early age. And at least since 1973, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, same-sex attraction is no longer considered a psychiatric disorder. Prior to 1973, it was. The thing I'd like you to consider in regard to that is that ask yourself, what is the DSM actually based on? And we're all probably working with DSM-5 now, and we know that substance use disorders are significantly changed in this particular version of the DSM. So think about it for a moment. What is it that the DSM is really based on? It's based on research. So let's be really clear that our understanding of sexual orientation, our understanding of substance use disorders has evolved as the data has become available, as the research has been done, and as things have become more clear. So same-sex attraction is no longer a psychiatric disorder. What still remains in the DSM-5 is the diagnosis of gender dysphoria for transgender people. Prior to that, it was called gender identity disorder. There was a tremendous amount of advocacy amongst transgender individuals, people in a variety of professions, medical personnel, to remove any type of diagnosis around transgender experience from the DSM. It was determined that gender dysphoria would be the new definition. There were lots of reasons why the movement to have the diagnosis removed completely was defeated, but we still have gender dysphoria. And keep in mind that what that really implies is that for an individual, a transgender man, a transgender woman, a gender nonconforming person, to be themselves, they must take on a psychiatric disorder in order to receive particular services and treatment that they might want to enhance the quality of their lives or protect their health. So it's still important to consider what that can mean to an individual in terms of the possible stigma that somebody may take on if indeed they have to receive a psychiatric diagnosis simply to be who they are. The last point I'll make here in regard to the work of the American Psychological Association is many of you may have heard about reparative or conversion therapy. Basically, the way that this has been described is that you have a particular sexual orientation and you're not comfortable with that orientation, or that orientation is causing you problems, so you go to a particular type of treatment or therapy, and having participated in that particular type of treatment or therapy, your sexual orientation magically has been changed. According to the APA, their research, their understanding of this particular type of therapy, that is untrue. An individual cannot change their sexual orientation. They can choose to refrain from particular sex acts, but it doesn't mean that their orientation is actually changed. The data around this actually shows that people who say their sexual orientations have been changed, there is a period where they cease to engage in particular sexual behaviors with particular individuals, but that is usually a short-lived effect of the therapy, and then the person reverts to baseline. Also important to consider as we work with people who are coming out, people who are transitioning, that reparative and conversion therapy is considered unethical and dangerous in the entire United Kingdom, And in some of the states in our country, it's illegal to practice it. But again, the thing to consider is that there still are individuals who practice this type of therapy, which most of the research actually shows is detrimental to an individual's health. So, having said that, let's talk a little bit about sex at birth and gender. And again, we're establishing a baseline as we move into a deeper exploration of what coming out actually is. So, you've had the opportunity so far, we've probably been talking together for maybe 7 minutes or so, maybe a little more than that. You've had an opportunity to look at me, hear my voice, understand some of what I'm saying. And I would venture to guess you've probably decided through your experience, the filters that you have unconsciously in your head, what my sex at birth is. So take a moment and take another look and decide what sex I am. Now, if you think my sex is male, raise your right hand, wherever you are. If you think my sex is female, raise your left hand, wherever you are. If you have no idea what my sex is, raise both of your hands, wherever you are. Now, the reality is that unless you saw my genitalia, which you're not going to, because that wouldn't be appropriate, you wouldn't know what my sex at birth was. Or the other way you could know is if you saw my chromosomes. And I probably won't be showing you those during this 90 minutes as well. So those would really be the most definitive ways that you would be able to tell what my sex at birth was. But essentially, probably prior to my asking you that question, you had pretty much determined what my sex at birth was. Again, based on your experience, based on the information that you have in terms of what I've expressed to you during the course of our time together so far. So let's be very clear that sex at birth is biological. When we're talking about this, we are talking about chromosomes, genitalia, secondary sex characteristics such as facial hair, body fat distribution, and hormones, which again can be altered through treatment and through hormone therapy, through a variety of things, sex reaffirming surgeries. There are 3 options for sex at birth: female, intersexed, and male. Now, intersexed people are individuals who are born sometimes with the genitalia of both sexes, or they have what is referred to as ambiguous genitalia, genitalia that doesn't fall into a classic construction of what we think of when we think of female genitalia or male genitalia. So, one thing that I'd like to point out is that nature loves diversity. So if we were all in a room together and we compared genitalia, if all the men compared their genitalia and all the women compared their genitalia, we would see a lot of diversity in the shape, color, size of the genitalia. So again, nature loves diversity. And intersexed individuals are individuals that have what is, as I said before, referred to as ambiguous genitalia, or they have the genitalia of both sexes. They also have different chromosomal structure than people who are identified solely as female or male. So that sort of lays out when we think of assigned sex at birth. Now we're going to talk a little bit about gender. Gender basically is culturally derived. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about what's defined in a particular culture, and different cultures have different definitions, but what's defined in a particular culture as the expectations of femaleness or maleness. So in our Western culture, we live with what's sometimes framed as the binary myth, meaning that there are only 2 culturally sanctioned genders, those being female and male. You are either female or you are male. There's nothing in between. And again, that's what we call in our culture a binary myth. So I'd like you to think about what we said about sexual orientation. We said that sexual orientation was on a continuum. So you can also think of gender identity as also being on a continuum. And again, the culture prescribes boys get a blue blanket when they're born, girls get a pink blanket. Culture basically describes and sanctions all those different specific elements that divide the sexes. And the culture works to reinforce that myth. But think of gender identity similarly to sexual orientation in terms of it also being on a continuum. So gender identity can be on a continuum that is exclusively male expressed or female expressed, or it can be anywhere along that continuum. The other sort of gender expression that people are probably more familiar with is androgyny, which is not really expressing yourself in a way that's not particularly male or particularly female. But there are many points on that continuum. And for many people, gender identity is a journey, it's not a destination. For many people, gender identity is fluid. I have had the opportunity to work with a very influential and intelligent transgender advocate named Carrie Davis, who I've heard say a few times, there are as many gender identities as there are people on the planet. And again, that speaks to how unique gender identity is for each individual. So we said sexual orientation was a unique experience, and no two heterosexuals are the same. The same with gender identity. No two women identify with their femaleness exactly the same. So again, we're really looking at the uniqueness of each individual. And frankly, when you think about the work that you do with your clients, that is the kind of treatment that we want to be able to offer, where we have the opportunity to really know who the person in front of us is so that we can craft treatment that really is going to help them achieve their health and life goals. So being able to understand the complexities of that and not making any assumptions about it, and practicing from what has been framed as a culturally humble perspective, is the way to best achieve the results you want to achieve in your work. So, when we think of gender, I'd like us to also break it down into 4 distinct ways of looking at it. The first is identity. When I asked you to look at me and think about my sex at birth, you were also probably making assumptions about my gender identity. And what I can tell you is when someone looks at you, they can't see your gender identity. Your gender identity is your personal understanding of your femaleness or maleness or somewhere on that continuum. So someone can't really see that. That's how you feel about yourself. Gender expression, when I asked you to look at me, is what you can see. You can see the way my hair is cut. You can see if I'm clean shaven or not. You can see if I have what kind of clothes I'm wearing. You can see these things that all express my male gender. I identify as a cisgender male. And I'll break down the difference between trans and cis in a moment. And cisgender is spelled C-I-S. So we'll get to what that means in a moment. So identity you can't see, expression is what you can see. Role often speaks to the societal expectations of what a man is supposed to do and what a woman is supposed to do. And again, as broken down in a very sort of binary myth perspective. And then there's gender attribution. And what I'd like us to consider here is, I often frame this as that gender attribution is what's called doing the math. When we look at somebody, we look at their gender expression, we look at how they're behaving, we look at the role that they're in, and then we attribute to them a particular gender. We say, this person is female, this person is male. Again, based on our filters and our attribution. The thing to consider here is that that's an assumption. It may not be accurate, and with that attribution of gender can often come an attribution of sexual orientation. And let's be really clear about that. What that really means is that if somebody is behaving in a gender non-conforming way, an assumption can be made about their sexual orientation as well. I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. But prior to doing that, I want to point out one other thing. In our culture, as it stands currently, when an individual walks into a room, and unless they walk into the room and they announce to everybody that they are not heterosexual, the assumption is that they are. If they walk into that room and they're doing something that's considered, or expressing themselves in a way that's considered gender non-conforming, they may be attributed not a heterosexual sexual orientation. But if they walk in and they, quote unquote, pass as heterosexual, the assumption is made again that they are heterosexual. And the point I'm making here is those assumptions aren't always accurate, and they do not help us in our work with our clients. In fact, they can cause great distance and damage in that relationship. So now to the example that I mentioned. This is a true story. It happened in 2008. Two brothers were in Bushwick, Brooklyn. They had gone to church together, and then after church they had decided to go have some drinks at a bar. One of the brothers got particularly intoxicated, was finding it difficult to walk. He had had so much to drink. It was a very cold winter evening, and one brother was supporting his brother, kind of holding him up, and he took his coat and put it around him to sort of keep him warm as well as hold him up so he wouldn't fall into the street. Individuals who lived in that neighborhood, who observed this particular behavior, did the math. Now, can you imagine what conclusion they came to based on their observation of the behavior that they saw? And let me describe the behavior again. Two men walking down the street, one of them holding the other with his coat around him. Yes, they made the assumption that they were gay men and that they were a couple. Given their assumption, they decided that they were going to take a particular course of action. And they killed one of the brothers. They beat both of them up and they killed one of them. So I share this example with you because I want you to understand the power behind attribution. When we make an assumption, it can trigger very strong motives and forces in us that can lead us to take particular actions. Had they been two gay men in a relationship, friendship, or they were lovers, partners, or husbands, it still would be equally tragic, horrible, and criminal. But again, the point here is that when we see gender nonconforming behavior, there can be the assumption that someone is same-sex attracted. So just something to consider as part of our foundation as we move into coming out. So, having said that, we're at coming out. And before we define that and explore that in greater depth, I'd like you to pause and I'd like you to think a moment. And I'd like you to think about if you were a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, queer, questioning, or intersexed individual, what would you do? Do you think that you would come out? Or would you not? And again, the phrase that's often used is that somebody stays in the closet. And we'll get to that in a moment. But what would you do? What would you personally do? So what I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to put yourself in the place of someone who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, questioning, or transgender, or intersexed. What would you do given the life that you have right now? Would you come out? If you would come out, who would you come out to? Who wouldn't you come out to? And let's be clear what we mean by come out. Share your sexual orientation or share your gender identity. Share a part of who you are. That people who have a heterosexual sexual orientation simply take for granted because of the assumption, quote unquote, that everybody is heterosexual. So what would you do? Answer that question for yourself as we move forward, which is, let's go back to the closet for a moment. Why the closet? Well, for some people, the reason they're in the closet, the reason they go back into the closet, the reason they stay in the closet is because that's the only thing that they can do to survive. There are still places in our world where individuals who have same-sex attraction, are same-sex attracted, are lesbian or gay, for them to come out and express that basically would mean that they could be murdered or imprisoned or shunned by the community simply because they are who they are. So for some individuals, the closet is about survival. For other people, it's about safety and being able to function in a world that stigmatizes their particular gender or their particular sexual orientation. So they're basically just trying to stay safe. And one of the things that you can really consider, and hopefully you will consider especially when you're working with people who are in the coming out process, is are you creating a context where they are safe to be who they are, and are you helping them to determine prior to disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity, is it a safe place, person, situation for them to do that? And that can be part of the work that you do as you support people if they choose to go through the coming out process to the degree that's right for them. So we'll end sort of the closet with the notion of personal price. So imagine again that you are that LGBTQI person. What do you think the personal price might be to not be able to talk about the people you love in your life? To not be able to talk about what you did over the weekend? To worry that you could lose your housing if somebody finds out a particular information about you? So imagine for yourself the personal price that you might pay in order to simply survive or to feel safe. And again, it's a way that you can sort of frame the idea of what it really means for an individual to come out on a variety of levels. So here's sort of a breakdown definition of what the coming out process is. And again, I really appreciate the way that this is framed on this particular slide, that it's process versus an event. Now, from the LGBTQI person's perspective, it's very much a process. Sometimes for the people that they come out to, it's more of an event. But there is a process that has led up to that particular disclosure, which the person who receives the disclosure may experience as an event. But it's not an event for that person coming out. It is part of some lengthy process that they are possibly going through or have gone through. Now again, coming out can be a lifelong process, and it's about developing a positive gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender identity. And again, it's about developing that identity because they may not have that particular identity currently, and they may have a very adversarial, troubled, uncomfortable relationship with their own sexual orientation or gender identity in context of their life at that moment. So it can be a struggle for some people because of internalized homophobia that they have, or discriminatory practices or experiences that they've actually had in their life. Think about it. If you have been discriminated against by expressing yourself in a particular way, wanting to have a particular type of romantic or sexual partner, there's a possibility that you might struggle with owning that because it feels to you that something bad is going to happen to you. And ultimately we come back to safety, because people want to feel safe. And sometimes to feel safe, people will make tremendous sacrifices. And as you know, substance use disorders are often among people who've experienced significant trauma. And being rejected, experiencing violence, being discriminated against, and all of those things chronically can create tremendous anxiety, fear, tension, which can result in trauma for individuals. And individuals may need to struggle and work through some of that internalized oppression before they can actually feel safe enough to come out. And again, that can be the basis of some of the work that you do with particular people who you have the opportunity to work with. And it truly is an opportunity when somebody shares with you the process of really owning and feeling strong and developing strength about who they are. So that really can be a very satisfying opportunity for any kind of human service provider. So let's look at this diagram of the coming out continuum. I think it can be helpful to look at this because it really speaks to a dynamic and a process, and again, process, not an event, that an individual goes through. First, there's that personal process. The person realizes something about me is different. And they come to realize what that something is. And the personal sort of process, struggle, not always a struggle, but for many people a struggle, of who they really are, who they truly know themselves to be. Then there's the interpersonal element of it. After, or maybe even while during, their personal experience of coming out, then it's the interpersonal interaction with the people they trust or are closest to or who know them best. And then there's the whole family dynamic of this continuum. And then after that, there's the social and occupational aspect of it. Some people aren't out at work. Some people aren't out socially. So all these pieces, and then the public in general. Are you who you are as you walk down the street on a daily basis? And the question I'd like you to consider is it safe for you to be who you are as you walk down the street in public every day of your life? And the reality is, as you know, from recent events and many past events, for LGBTQI people, it is still in some settings and places in our country and certainly in our world, for people, it is not safe for them to be who they are in public. So this continuum can help you to understand what the individual may be going through in terms of their process, and it can help you to focus on the work that you actually can do with that individual as they move through this process. So this algorithm, this continuum, can actually be a really helpful guide to what it is you're doing. So there are a variety of models that are available to sort of understand the coming out process. This is a model that was developed in Australia in 1979, Vivian Case. It's the homosexual identity model. Sounds very clinical. It can be helpful to look at these models as a way of, again, trying to understand the process and the tasks, the developmental tasks that an individual goes through. Note of caution. These are models. These are based on conglomerations of data. They don't always speak to an individual experience. And when we work with individuals, we tailor our interaction, we tailor our treatment plan to the particular individual. These are helpful guides. They are not prescriptions. So just be very clear about that. This is a tool that you can use that hopefully will inform your practice and strengthen your practice as you support people through this process. So let's take a look at the Vivian Case model. There are 5 stages to this particular model: identity awareness, identity comparison, identity tolerance, identity acceptance, and identity pride. You'll see from the subheadings that it sort of speaks to what's going on in each one of these particular stages. And again, this model is laid out almost in a linear fashion. Somebody moves from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4 to stage 5. It's not always that way. It may be that way in the textbook. It may be that way in the sort of combined data sets, but it's not always that way for the individual. This guide can help us to understand the process, but ultimately our meeting the individual where they are, our tuned listening to what their actual personal, interpersonal, familial, work-related, public-related experiences are really the things that will guide us in terms of our work. So, identity awareness. I mentioned this earlier, this notion that somehow an individual becomes aware that they're different. I've heard some people say, because I've had the opportunity to talk with a variety of people about their coming out experiences, that awareness actually came because they found that they felt unsafe in certain situations. So that awareness of difference can also be related to a feeling of risk. Identity comparison, this notion of that the feelings and emotions that I have, I don't identify with the same ones that identified heterosexuals may have. So that there's a difference. I'm comparing what I feel, what I think, to what somebody who I understand to be heterosexual thinks and feels. And there's a dissonance there. There's not an agreement. There may be some agreement, but there are some things that don't actually match up. So I've realized I'm different, and I realize I don't have the same feelings as this person whom I've identified as heterosexual. Then there's identity tolerance, this idea that the individual goes through a process and a period of where they tolerate their identity not being heterosexual. So I think it's important to particularly pause on stage 3, identity tolerance, because you cannot think about that without thinking about the context within which that person is experiencing their gender identity or their same-sex attraction or their bisexual attraction. So if you think about the context, in our Western culture, it's basically a heterosexual world. So individuals are within that particular world view, that particular societal view, so they're tolerating something that is really separating them from the majority, that's potentially separating them from their family, that's potentially separating them from their friends, something that's potentially causing risk and harm in their life if people are to find out about it. So you have to understand the identity tolerance within the construct of the society surrounding the individual. and they've internalized all those negative messages to what they've realized about themselves. Then there's identity acceptance. Individual accepts the new identity, and they begin to become active in a gay community. And again, what is a gay community? That can mean many different things to many different people. There are many gay communities, and people who are LGBTQI identified sort of move between a variety of communities. But in this stage, the individual accepts their new identity or their true identity, and they begin to interact with this community. And then there's stage 5 is what's referred to as identity pride, where the individual becomes proud of their identity and, as again in the language of this model, becomes fully immersed in gay culture. And again, that may mean very different things to different people, but there's an acceptance that I am a part of this particular community, and I embrace and I own that. So again, this is a model. This is a tool to help us understand what somebody may be experiencing, what they may be going through. So, I think it's important to keep in mind too, and perhaps as we're working with our clients, to help them to think about what are some of the benefits of coming out, what are some of the risks, and what are some of the fears. So, being clear that they can make a choice about, do they want to disclose their gender identity? Do they want to disclose their sexual orientation? That the individual is empowered to choose if they want to do that. And they can prepare prior to doing it and explore prior to doing it to see who they want to share that very intimate information with, when and how they might want to share that information, and if they want to share that information. There may be some individuals that a person chooses never to come out to. I have friends that I've discussed this with about coming out to their parents, and several of my friends have mentioned that they never came out to their fathers, but they came out to their mothers. And they make a distinction between coming out, telling their mother, or their mother knowing without them telling them. And again, coming out is about making the disclosure. And some of my friends have mentioned that they specifically chose not to come out to their fathers, and some of them, their fathers have passed away, and they've expressed a certain amount of regret that their father they felt never truly knew them, because they didn't feel it was safe, didn't feel comfortable to share that information with that particular parent. So again, helping people to understand that they have a choice, helping them to plan and think about who, how, when, where, and if they actually want to come out. So, I also think it's important to say a little bit about outing here. And outing is about disclosing somebody's sexual orientation or their gender identity without their permission. What I would like to say is that, and I'm sure this won't be any surprise to anybody, is that you really want to consider that this can be a very traumatic experience to somebody, because it can open them to harassment, violence, murder. So it's important to discuss and think about coming out if that's appropriate for the individual, so that they're not put in a position where somebody, quote unquote, can out them. So again, outing can be very traumatic. It can be helpful to check in with people to see, as you're doing your history, your work with them, have they been outed? What was their experience of that? Has someone threatened to out them? Sometimes in intimate partner violence, one partner will threaten to out the individual to a particular family member or in a work setting as a way to control them. So this is something that we also have to keep in mind as we think about, quote unquote, the coming out process. Because our goal really is to promote confidence and control in our clients, that they feel confident and in control of how they choose to share this intimate information about who they are. And that we're helping them to discern safe people, places, and situations to actually do that in. Because of course, we want to make sure first and foremost that our clients are safe and that they stay safe. So, these are some of the possible benefits. Again, this is a list. There are probably many more, but being able to be open and integrated about your whole life and giving up what some people refer to as a double life. Now, meaning that in one moment I'm this, and in another situation or setting, I'm that. A person can simply be who they are and live openly. Can also really impact and build self-esteem because people are empowered. They're not necessarily devoting a tremendous amount of energy of keeping something back. They can actually begin to feel good about themselves. And you can go back to the case model that we talked about, because building self-esteem is actually part of that lifelong process. And again, keep in mind that the lack of self-esteem is because of the social messages, the familial messages that the individual may have internalized about their value because they are different in terms of their gender identity or sexual orientation. A benefit may also be that people can develop closer, more genuine relationships with their significant family members, their friends, because they, again, can share who they are, alleviating stress and the fear of hiding one's identity or the fear of being found out in terms of what will the consequences be if my mother knows this, my father knows this. One can sort of let go of some of that stress or that fear. More opportunities, possibly, if the individual wants to connect with other people who identify as LGBTQI. Also feeling some sort of community affiliation and the opportunity actually to serve as a role model for other people who may be considering coming out. So these are some of the possible benefits. And there are probably many more, but I think these are some of the things that can come out of an individual making a choice about disclosing their gender identity or their sexual orientation. In a moment, we're actually going to have the opportunity to talk with somebody about his experience of the coming out experience. And as a way of kind of moving into that, I would like to say a word about physical and mental health in regard to LGBTQI people. I think it's really important to keep in mind that sexual orientation and gender identity in and of themselves do not cause physical and mental health disorders. It's similar to what we discussed before, that you need to think about the fact that individuals experience their gender identity and their sexual orientations within the context of our society. And certain parts of our society actually seek to impose heterosexual conformity, and certain elements of our society especially punish gender nonconformity and expression and behavior that is gender nonconforming. So just as a way of considering that someone who may have a substance use disorder, who's a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersexed, queer, or questioning individual, may have reached for substances in the first place as a response to hostility, fear, anxiety, violence, harassment that they may have experienced simply being who they are in the particular setting that they were in. So keeping that in mind, we now have the opportunity to speak with Jeff, who will talk to us a bit about his experience of coming out. He's on the line. And I want to first start by thanking Jeff for being here with us today. And Jeff, I wanted to just ask, what are your preferred pronouns?
he, his.
Okay.
I think those are my preferred pronouns.
Excellent, thank you. And Jeff, how do you identify in terms of your gender identity and your sexual orientation?
I guess as a gay black man, that's probably the most succinct way of looking at it.
Excellent, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about, or what you'd like to share with us about your individual coming out experience?
I sort of had a strange coming out experience. I know it was kind of segmented in the sense that I felt a genuine need to tell my mother, and the way I did it was I brought her out, took her out for a meal. It was dinner, and we had a restaurant, and my meal consisted of about 4 or 5 margaritas before I sort of summoned up the courage to sort of tell her, and it was kind of an interesting, her reaction was, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I mean, thank you for telling me. And so you sort of got this mixed message, like there was that my coming out was an error, but she was glad that I told her. And for other people that I knew, I don't really recall, sitting them down and saying specifically to friends or other family. I have a very small family, and I don't recall really seeing them. I guess the information just sort of had like a trickle-down effect for the most part.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask you another question?
No.
Okay. So you described for us your coming out to your mom, and you're really identifying that is the most overt coming out that you recall. Can you say a little bit, did you have a process of where you went through sort of coming out to yourself?
Not that I know. Honestly, it was more. I think the process of coming out to myself was subsequent to that, and if that makes sense, was that it was to a certain extent, I think it is still an ongoing process. But I think it was more understanding myself in a sexual or romantic context, and that took a long time for me to, and lots of therapy, not so many margaritas, but a lot of searching to sort of find the right, I don't know, what fit best for me is probably the best way I can say it.
Yeah. So, and you identify that as kind of an ongoing process.
Yeah. It wasn't something that I definitively said, I'm good. I looked in the mirror and said, I'm gay, I'm good, let's go, and keep it moving. It was more a sort of a long-term kind of coming to terms with it, because in the African American community, it was, particularly at that time, it wasn't something that was acceptable. Particularly with my mother, who had talked a lot about there was this kind of almost tragically funny kind of thing where there were a finite amount of black men, and we couldn't really afford to have any of them stray from the path of righteous heterosexuality. So any sort of straying of that sort was looked on as sort of a betrayal and you realize that was set within the context of somebody who'd lived through the civil rights era and sort of lived through the pre-civil rights era, which is even more, in some ways, more traumatic and more of a driver of her behavior.
So there's that whole element of minority stress, as well as adding sort of sexual orientation on top of that. Yeah.
And honestly, the racism and prejudice, I guess, is covering both racism and homophobia. racism has been much more of a how would I describe it? A challenge is probably the most polite way of putting it. But and therefore, it's interesting that I said a gay black man when actually, technically speaking, I would say it's a black gay man. I identify as being a black gay man because race to me is still like the much bigger obstacle in terms of my normalizing within our society.
Thank you so much for everything that you've shared, and I want to ask you one final question, which is that, we have the opportunity to be broadcasting this particular program to a wide range of service providers, and predominantly many of them will be substance use disorder service providers, but there's a wide range on here, and I'm wondering from your perspective, what advice or what feedback would you give to providers as a way to successfully and appropriately provide support and or counseling to people who are in the process of coming out, and maybe early coming out or more advanced, experienced coming out?
Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I didn't let you finish.
That's okay.
I guess I think that there is each person, and this is going to sound simplistic, but each person's process of coming out and each person's perspective on their sexuality is going to be unique. And if it makes any sense to work from that perspective, so there's a lot more listening and a lot more clarification, I think, is going to be, the more you try and clarify and get a sense of what the person's experiencing is best. I think that once you start to think that it forms to a shape that you've already experienced or that you've got or predetermined, then I think you're going to lose that person, some of that person's identity, and some of that important stuff that's going to help them become comfortable with who they are.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your time, and I think that what you shared will be really valuable to the people who are on the broadcast. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, again, take in what you've heard and think about how you can really translate that into the work that you're doing or the work that you may do going forward. And if you're already working with people who are coming out or in the coming out process, either around their gender identity or their sexual orientation, is what we're talking about today, is what you heard from Jeff, something that may shape, influence, or impact how you work going forward? So, a few things to keep in mind as we continue to move through our slide set. Again, people who are in this coming out process, as we've already said, but I think that this graphic really helps us to understand it in a broad and individual way, is that these are some of the societal issues that an individual really faces. This notion of heterocentrism, the ideology of heterosexuality, heterosexism, which is the system that assumes that everyone is heterosexual so that we're all alike, and then homophobia that may come to individuals from people outside of them, and also internalized homophobia that the person may carry in them because they are located within heterocentrism and heterosexism. They've brought those things internally into themselves, and some of the work that we do is helping to support people to remove those negative messages about their identity. So these are some of the things that people who come out face and continue to face. Now, there are a variety of risks and fears that people potentially take, experience if they come out, and you'll see here rejection, loss or change of relationships, communities or groups, your status in a particular community or group, gossip, harassment, abuse, being thrown out of the family home, being thrown out of the family and also being thrown out of the home, being thrown out onto the street. And many of you are probably familiar with many of the statistics and the data around young LGBTQI individuals who basically turn to survival sex because they have been thrown out of their homes because their parents were not able to go through a process of accepting their child as their child truly is. Loss of financial support, jobs, physical violence, murder, and discrimination on a variety of levels. And let's be very clear. In our country currently, many LGBT people, their rights, their basic human rights, their rights to use particular restrooms where they would feel most comfortable are not protected. People can be fired, they can lose their homes, they can be discriminated against based on their sexual orientation and their gender identity. We live in New York State, and there may be viewers from other states who have a different experience. Discrimination continues to happen, and unless we all act as advocates, standing up for the basic human rights of our fellows, this discrimination will probably continue. So again, your participation today, simply listening to this, is a way of being an advocate. So these are some of the possible risks and fears that individuals may encounter in their process of coming out. When we sit with our individual clients, although we may not be of the same gender identity that they are, we may not have the same sexual orientation that they have, one thing we do have in common is these basic human needs. These become particularly important for an LGBTQI person when they're in the coming out process. Being accepted for who they are, not judged. Support, understanding, comfort, reassurance that, and hopefully people can get this from friends and family as well, that their relationships won't be negatively affected now that they have shared this particular intimate information. It is also possible to have closer relationships. We talked about some of the benefits. Closer relationships can be a benefit of the coming out process. Acknowledging of feelings and validation of those particular feelings, and love. These are all basic human needs. Regardless of our sexual orientation or our gender identity, we all have these basic human needs. And in the coming out process, these become particularly important and can be guides for us about how we choose to practice and interact with our clients that may be going through this process. So, why isn't everybody out? We've discussed the benefits. So what I'd like you to do now, I asked you at the beginning of this webinar to get something to write with and to get some paper to write on. So I'd like you to ask yourself, given everything that we've talked about, given what you heard from Jeff, I'd like you to ask yourself, why isn't everybody out? And just jot down whatever comes into your head, why you think people might not be out. And just jot down, write down anything that comes into your head. Try not to think about it too much. Just let whatever comes up come up. And just make this list. Now, before I go to the next slide, which has its own list on it, what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you make your list, I'm going to ask you to compare your list to the list that I'm going to show you. Because my list may not be as comprehensive as yours. It may not be as regionally specific as yours. But I want us to understand that there are valid reasons why some people to this day, at this particular moment, still do not choose to come out and may selectively, very selectively come out based on a variety of these things. So, I'm going to show you my list. You compare it to your list. Could be fear, stigma associated with the particular gender identity that they come out with or the sexual orientation that they come out with. Discrimination, we've already talked about a variety of discriminations and how the laws currently don't protect people. Some people might say to themselves they're too old to come out. They might say they're too young to come out. Socioeconomics, they may not feel if they come out that they can risk their employment situation by making that disclosure. Vulnerability may be a reason people don't want to come out. To share who you really are, to be who you are, requires a degree of vulnerability. You put yourself in a vulnerable position. Some people may also feel shame. That internalized homophobia can cause people to still feel ashamed about who they choose or who they want to be sexual with, how they choose to express their gender identity. That shame can be something that can keep people from actually disclosing who they are. Now that's my list. It's not very long. It's fairly broad, but it's not very long. Compare that to your list. And really, if somebody hasn't come out, but they've disclosed to you, they've shared their sexual orientation with you, so essentially they have come out to you, but they may not have come out in other areas of their life. One thing that I think it's critical to understand as we work with clients in this particular situation, our job is not to force people to come out. Our job is to help people to choose what is going to be best for their safety, for their physical and their emotional health, and what's going to help them to have the life that they want to have. We may have pretty strong feelings. We may be LGBT people ourselves providing these services who may or may not be out. And we may have strong feelings about what we think our particular client, the person sitting across from us, should do. What I'm going to ask is that please keep in mind that you want to stay very aware of that and you want to work that through with your supervisor, with trusted colleagues, and again, meet the person where the person's at. I thought it particularly valuable in the many valuable things that Jeff said when he talked about this perspective is that everybody's coming out experience is unique and everybody's life is unique. So we don't want to assume that just because it was safe for somebody in one particular town to come out, it's safe for another person in that town to come out. Their life is different. So again, our job is not to force people to come out. Here's another three-phase model, again, that can be used as a helpful guide, something to consider as we work with people and help them move through different phases. And again, this model is about recovery from shame, which, as you'll see here, it parallels the process of coming out. So again, this is just a possible model for you to consider or to look into in greater detail if you find this information interesting. So phase one, the overarching concept of that particular phase is breaking the silence. You'll notice in the bullets that follow, it talks about the work that the therapist, the counselor can actually do with this individual as they work through this particular phase. Again, facilitate personal discussion of hiding LGBT feelings from others. Explore emotional costs of hiding, denying one's sexuality. You can see that these bullets lay out the terrain of a conversation, a dialogue that you can hopefully safely have with this particular individual. And again, you're going to want to pay particularly close attention to sort of your client's reaction, the person's reaction to this particular exploration, because that will give you insight into strengths and challenges that this individual may be experiencing. So phase 1, breaking the silence. Let's look at phase 2. Establishing perpetrator responsibility. Now, the languaging of that I found particularly intriguing. And I find it intriguing because it speaks to what we talked about earlier, that it really puts the onus on the culture at large. It identifies the culture as the perpetrator so that the individual can understand and better understand their experience as an individual living with this gender identity or living with this particular sexual orientation within the context of their social construct. So again, allows people to understand their struggle in the context of minority stress, societal discrimination, and prejudice. Possibly you yourself, for a variety of reasons, or one particular reason, may have experienced minority stress, societal discrimination, or prejudice of some kind. So keep that in mind as you think about this particular phase. And if you haven't experienced those things, it can be particularly important for you to raise your awareness that other people may have experienced them. And again, you'll notice that the counselor tasks are basically laid out in these particular bullets. Facilitate focusing and managing anger constructively, not destructively. I'm not sure if people have heard of this particular idea in sort of the substance use recovery arena, this notion of that sometimes substance use and abuse is considered or thought of as a slow suicide. So helping people to understand that it's normal that they may be angry, that they've been discriminated against, that they've experienced prejudice, and instead of acting that out on themselves, they can express the anger and take actions to manage it in a way that's not destructive to their health. Help the person understand and accept a negative self-image as sociocultural, not personal. Again, this notion of separating, I'm not a bad person. I'm being told by forces outside of me that I'm bad and I have no value. And understanding and being able to discern the realities of one's personhood and the pressures of the society impacting one's personal experience. Counteract personal experience of heterosexism and homophobia by role modeling and by providing a treatment environment that is empowering for an LGBT person and not stigmatizing. First and foremost, we want to create a context within which an individual is safe to be who they are and feel that they have a degree of control about what happens next. So again, these can be helpful guides as we work with individuals who are in this process. Let's look at phase 3. Reclaiming personal power. You'll also notice if after the fact, and I think that these slides can be made available to you if you want them, so feel free to request them, but you may also notice if you were to compare this 3-phase model with the case model that we talked about earlier, that there is definitely overlap. And I'm particularly reminded of that in this Reclaiming Personal Power section. Involves improving self-concept, self-esteem, and self-confidence. Now think about it. If you're feeling better about your self-concept, you have greater self-esteem, and you feel self-confidence, what do you think that can lead to? That can lead to better health, physically and emotionally. That can lead to the achievement of life goals. That can lead to contributions to communities and society as a whole. So this process and these kind of supports that you can help people receive can actually lead to, and again, a perfect example of this is someone who has a long history of, let's say, alcohol abuse, and regardless of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, through the process of recovery, and I don't mean that just from the substance that they're using, from the alcohol use, through the process of their recovery, they can build a life that actually is fulfilling and helps them achieve the goals that they want to achieve, and then ultimately is able to give back and make a contribution. The same can happen for LGBTQI individuals in regard to their ability to feel good about themselves and confident that they have something to offer. Again, the counselor tasks are outlined here. Facilitate person's self-concept and self-efficacy. If you believe you can do something, if you believe you have the strength to do it, you're more likely to take an action. Identify and change negative messages to affirmations. Recognize and release residual shame. Develop a positive affirming spirituality, if that's appropriate for the individual. Integrate public and private identities so there's not this double life. And build a support network and connect a community. So again, this is another model that we can use to guide what we do. Let's talk briefly about substance use. Now, I'm going to start with this particular statistic that you can see on the slide right now. I find this particularly sobering and disturbing. 20 to 30% of people who are members of the LGBT community may struggle with substance use disorders. Now, if you think about that within the sociocultural context, and you think about minority stress, that figure starts to make sense, especially compared to 10% of the population as a whole that may have substance use disorders. So it speaks to the greater degree of trauma, stress, and tension that LGBT people may experience and why they may use particular substances, and I'll use this phrase, to self-medicate. So again, something to consider in terms of substance use. So these are some of the things, if you're working with somebody who identifies as LGBTQI, you might want to make sure, and they're using substances, you might want to make sure that you cover and get a sense of their level of comfort being an LGBT person and where they are, if they have, or are they in the process of coming out, and what their family and support network is like, health factors that are facing them, places that they may use, and it may be a place or places, the drug use and sexual identity and sexual behavior connections. So are they using substances as a way to engage in particular sexual behaviors? Or are they using substances as part of their sexual behaviors and a way to connect with other people? Are they using with a particular partner or partners? Are there any legal problems related to their sexual behavior? Have they experienced any gay bashing or violence directed at them? And is there any same-gender intimate partner violence? And have they been out in the past as an LGBT person in treatment experiences that they may have had? And what are the correlates, what are the things that relate to or help them in their sober periods, if they've indeed had sober periods? So these are some of the considerations that you want to make sure that you cover when you're working with an LGBTQI person who has a history or is currently using substances. And again, you'll see that the stage of coming out is identified here. So we'll start to bring our time together to a close by looking at what I'm framing as safe practices. And I framed it that way because first and foremost, the thing I want you to always keep in mind, and I'm sure you do with all of your clients, but some clients need a particular type of safety, because we want to make sure that we communicate to LGBTQI people that they are safe when we are working with them. So, certainly you're going to be taking a family history. This lays out some of the points that you would cover in terms of taking a family history. And you'll notice if you look at the side where it says add for LGBT people, it gives, you really want to make sure that you cover these particular points in that history because they are significant to that individual's experience. And again, I really appreciated what Jeff said about listening. Because if you don't ask these questions, you're not going to hear the details of this individual's life. Our job, I think, and again, you may or may not agree with me on this, but I do believe our job is to make sure that we provide the best care possible. And my belief is that the only way we can do that is if we have a deep and intimate understanding of an individual's life and their experience, and an understanding of their needs as shaped by that experience. So you'll see these particular points pertaining, is anyone in the family else acknowledged as or suspected of being an LGBT person? How did the family respond to that individual's coming out? Again, as a way of kind of foreshadowing if this person was to choose to come out, or if they did come out, what was their experience like? And is that person out only to the client, the patient who's there, or are they out to the whole family? And again, what was that experience like? So again, these are the particular pieces that you want to make sure that you have an understanding of. Also, family history continued. If the person is out, what type of response did they receive? I've said that. And was same-sex sex or gender ever discussed in the family? Did the individual take in some internal message because same-sex sex or gender was discussed in a negative way? Again, that can impact. People are influenced by the shaping of the family messaging that they get. Now, LGBT people regularly develop what has been coined as family of choices, or a family of choice. And the reason for that, I think early on, and this still happens today, but I think early on the reason that that phrase was coined is because individuals had the experience of basically being disowned and rejected by their families. And the reality is that individuals need other people, they need love, acceptance, and support. And LGBT people, as a sign of resiliency, created families of choice that offered them and met the needs that they needed to be fulfilled. So it's important to understand when we think about and we're taking, quote unquote, a family history, that we understand the concept of family of choice, because we want to have a full picture of an LGBTQI person's experience of family. And you'll notice in the fourth bullet, that experience can also include individuals who are no longer with that person. They are still considered part of that person's family, meaningful and important. And again, it's helpful for us to have that kind of understanding. So, here are some guidelines that you can keep in mind. Again, I think these are broad guidelines. They speak to some general concepts that we can all keep in mind. Certainly, interacting with and respecting significant others of the client we're working with is critical, because we don't want to communicate that we're intolerant or not respectful of the family of choice, the husband, the wife, the partner, the lover of the LGBTQI person. We also want to be sensitive to the individual's identity or identities. because people may be fluid in their identity, and we want to be sensitive and clear about that. You may recall that when Jeff spoke to us, I asked him what his preferred pronouns were. I wanted to make sure that when I spoke with him, I was going to refer to him or address him in a way that was going to be respectful to him. And we also want to be clear that LGBTQI relationships, not unlike any other sexual orientation who has relationships with other human beings, can manifest in a variety of ways that may or may not be your experience. So we want to respect the diversity of those relationships in an individual's life. And keeping in mind that like in any community, including the LGBTQI communities, there's no universal terminology really for anything. The bullet says for significant others, but there's not really any universal terminology. People will often come to a training and say, you know, I just want to make sure I don't offend anybody. So I want to be sure that I say it right. Well, chances are, if you're not a member of that community, one of the perspectives of cultural humility, and even if you are a member of that community, doesn't guarantee that you know the terminology. But one of the tenets of cultural humility is that you're never going to know what another community's experience is. So you want to be tuned into, you want to take their lead, and you want to be respectful and curious in a respectful way about what certain words mean if you don't know what they mean. Also, be aware of your own biases. Again, part of cultural humility is knowing what your experience is, where you sit, what you bring to the table. And again, as professionals, we have the capacity to have that awareness and manage our own experience and our own affect so that we don't act that out in an unconscious or a conscious way with any of our clients. And we want to be very careful not to assume that just because somebody may identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, that they haven't had other interactions or relationships with people of the opposite sex. So there can be an assumption that, oh, this person has never done X, Y, or Z. We want to be careful of any assumptions, but we want to be clear, especially if we're taking a sexual history, that we want to make sure that we understand the full breadth of that person's experience. So, having said that, I really want to thank you for your participation in today's broadcast, and I really want you to consider that the simple fact that you tuned into this, that you've participated, that you've thought about some of what we talked about, really does have the potential to impact the lives of LGBTQI people. And the last thought I'd really like to leave you with is that how you practice, what you do when you're sitting across from that person, really can make a difference to the success, to the health of that individual's coming out experience, and to their life overall. So we're really fortunate to have the opportunity to have these discussions. And again, I thank you for your participation. And I will end with, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, don't hesitate to contact me using my contact information here. And again, I thank you for any feedback that you may offer us. So please take a moment and fill out the SurveyMonkey survey. It's critical for the life of these programs and for their continuation that we have your feedback and that we can use that feedback to develop material that'll be meaningful for the work that you're doing. So please do take a moment and fill out the survey. What you have to offer us is really valuable, and we'd like to hear what you think. And having said that, again, thank you for joining us, and all the best.